Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is my year-end favorite books that I've read this year. This is the big one. This is the one that everyone is looking forward to. This is one I'm looking forward to. And I hope if you're new, if you're old, thank you for joining me. If you're new here, some of what you might expect in terms of my reading preferences, I'd say are more so. I read a lot of 20th century literature, particularly stuff in the 20s and 30s, as well as the 60s and 70s. But that's not to say that I exclusively read that. I would say that a lot of it is literary fiction, science fiction, and varieties beyond that. When it comes to nonfiction, it's a lot of more contemporary stuff in the last 5-10 years. So you're in for a good mix of what to expect. I'm going to keep this to my top 10. And I could pick a little bit more, but I think it's going to go pretty long. So I'm going to keep it to the top 10. This is in order. I wish I had all the copies here. Unfortunately, some are library books. Some are things that I lent out or bought for other people. So I don't exactly have copies for everything. And we'll get to it as best I can. So number 10. Let me get to the shelves, which if you are a returning person might know there's two of them now. That's exciting, right? I now have all of my books. Gosh, this is not easy to find now. I haven't learned them yet. Every time I change the shelves. I now have all of my books in one place. I used to have them between spots. Boy, this is quite a lead up. I can't think of where it is because I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to spoil it. Where is it? It's right here. It's Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is a pretty common book. I think most people know this book. 1952, early 50s. I read this back in February. Now, I will say, I did not set many reading goals for myself, and something else I should probably have prefaced. I read about 42 books this year, which, for some people that's a lot, some people it's not. Got all sorts of discussion on that. I typically read between 30 and 40 books a year. And 42, that's the most I've read in terms of my adult life. Keeping track of this. Now, that's not to say that all of them were great. I think I read a lot of shorter books this year, which also added to that. My only reading goal when I went into this year was to read one 500-page book a month and then supplement that with whatever else. And so I didn't fully complete that. I would say at least over half the year I did. And in February, Black History Month and whatnot, I decided to finally get around to Ralph Ellison. And this is, it's a 500-page book, but it goes by very fast. It is, if you're someone who is not familiar with this book, if you're someone who's daunted by the idea of reading a book from 1952 and think it's going to be too difficult, the language is going to be hard, it's going to be slow, that is the opposite situation here. Ralph Ellison writes quite a high-impact, high-intensity book. It starts out pretty quick at the beginning. There's a boxing match, and the intensity only goes up from there. Now, when going into this, I didn't really know much about it. I didn't read this for school. I didn't take any courses covering, American literature of the middle 20th century or, African American literature, stuff like that. I thought this would be another thing. I read the year prior Richard Wright's Black Boy, and I thought it would be very similar. I thought it would just be kind of like an autobiographical African American male in the 20th century, pre-civil rights, kind of like biography of sorts, and to a little degree it is, but that's not exactly what it is. This is a book that follows the Invisible Man. You don't really know too much about him, but he goes from his life trying to make it in America as a black man in the I think it's probably the 40s or so. I can't remember exactly. It's a little bit prior to when it was published, and so of course he's living in Jim Crow, as well as the North, where it's a bit segregated and stuff like that. He goes from the South up to the North. This is a story that I think, if you've read a lot of African American literature, is kind of common. Which it's written well, but that's it's a common story. But where this really takes off, why it is on the top of the list, is it expands far beyond that. This is a book that really covers a concept that people like to call the long 60s. Which is it covers, you think of the stereotypical 60s, which is funny because, the 1960s itself is not really what we come to think of as the 1960s. 1962 or whatever, pre-civil rights, pre-Beatles, the LSD, stuff like that. Very different from like 1968, Haight-Ashbury kind of stuff. The idea though with the long 60s is it kind of starts with this and it goes all the way up to the 1973 Gravity's Rainbow. That's not gonna be fun to put back. This is, put it up top. I'm gonna make a mess of these shelves, so prepare yourselves. The idea being, yes, for about that like 19 years or so, it covers all these concepts of civil rights, equalizing cultures and ethnicities, and kind of like all that kind of stuff. And also conspiracies, big thing, distrust of the government, all that kind of stuff. So Ralph Ellison here, he writes The Invisible Man. The Invisible Man, I don't want to spoil too much of it, and I'm speaking quickly on it because I got 9 other books to talk about. Is it kind of gets into this conspiracy. The character here gets approached by a secret organization and is kind of told, you are going to lead the revolution, you are going to be the answer. And of course, he's speaking to black people, but he's also speaking to white people. I would honestly choose, if I'm going to put together a list of like top American literature, I'd put this on there, and for the main reason of this is a common story. The common story of our society picking a singular black person, typically a black man, and kind of thrusting them into the spotlight, whether they want to or not, and that typically does not end well. The most common, you can think about this, like I said, 1962, the most common thing is probably MLK. After that, you think about Barack Obama. You can think about it in more subcultural standpoints. Right now, I would say Kendrick Lamar is often seen in that light. You see one singular black man, and they are put in the spotlight. They are seen as the answer. They're seen as the answer a lot of times by white voices. And, like I said, that often does not end well. It destroys them due to ego, due to government interference, because, of course, they'll let this go on for, only as long as they're willing to tolerate it. And, yeah, really, it's just like the conspiracy stuff, it really goes well with the Pynchon. I think if you are a fan of Pynchon, you've never read Invisible Man, highly recommend. This is quite influential. I'm going to leave it at that because we will be talking forever. And I'm sure, of all these books, I think this is probably the most common that people have heard of. So, we will see about that. Next up, we've got End of the Road, John Barth. John Barth passed away this year. Passed away back, I think, in April. And I had this on my shelf already. And I was like, okay, now is the time to read it. I have been looking, for an excuse to read this book. A couple years ago, read Lost in the Funhouse. There's some really great stories in that, but as an entire collection, I wasn't super impressed. Very different here. The covers may be similar, not the same. This is John Barth's second novel, End of the Road. It came out in 1958. So we're in a bit of a theme here, the 1950s, which is not typically a time period I would say I read from. But this year it seems to be. 1958. This is his second novel. It is very short. How many pages? Under 200, I want to say. Yeah, just under 200, 198. This is a story of a young man who he's just out of graduate school. I think he just turned 28 and has become a teacher of sorts in this local town out in Maryland, which is where many John Barth stories take place. And from there on, he gets into all sorts of hijinks. There's a whole narrative with a therapist, doctor, who he treats him for being paralyzed. Now, paralyzed not in the physical sense of not being able to move, but paralyzed in life in terms of life choices, not knowing what to do with his life. It is a great allegory for just that kind of period in your life. It hit me at a really great point, which I think is why I'm picking this book. It felt very relatable. You typically end up with all these things where it's like, okay, where do I go from here? In life, you have so many choices. You don't want to fuck it up, and it's seemingly endless, the possibilities you might have. I think that's done exceptionally well here, like just the allegorical nature of it. In terms of the writing, it is often very humorous. I think it's a very impressive early novel. This is, you think of John Barth and you think of postmodernism, you think of more experimentation. This is pretty straightforward. This is not super challenging, so I think if you're trying to get into John Barth, this is a great starter. But I also, like I said, recommend it to someone who is just getting out of college or, in that time period of their life. I think it'll hit a lot more. yeah, it was really interesting. A lot of it too, like I said, 1958. It feels very 60s. If you want to add to this concept of the long 60s, I would recommend this because it reminds me. I feel like this has a big influence on Lot 49. Not to make this an entire Pynchon video, which I think is insane and innate that I would do so. Forgot I have a new copy of it. I got this. What I like to call the movie tie-in edition. So can't wait for that to be released back in. I think that copy's from the 80s. This narrative it really feels very inspiring of Lot 49 because it's just you're kind of along for the ride. You're meeting all this wacky cast of characters. It also feels a lot like The Graduate, which also adds to the 60s feel. He gets into a bit of a relationship with an older woman, and which feels very Mrs. Robinson. And a lot of it too is he goes through so I get this aimlessness, this being paralyzed, all that kind of stuff, or paralyzed in life. It's very interesting because you think about it in a narrative like this, or just life in general. Life will eventually take its course. Life will eventually intervene. You cannot just sit paralyzed forever. You're gonna eventually have something come up. Someone's gonna die. You're gonna lose your job. You're gonna, whatever's gonna happen. You're gonna eventually have to change in order to adapt to. The world doesn't just revolve around you. Stuff happens whether you like it or not. And so that's kind of what's happening here. He runs in all these crazy scenarios, and everyone in this story, it ends up terribly for that. Nothing really great happens to anyone else in the story. But the main character here, which I'm forgetting his name now, but Jacob Horner, ends up pretty unscathed, which I think adds to the absurdity and humor that you get with like a postmodern thing. So it's not really a great lesson because it's just like, oh yeah, things will work out in the end or whatever, which is not necessarily the case. But I think it's just very humorous that all the people he meets in his life, there's all sorts of problems. It's a very humorous, interesting, fun novel, and I think it's kind of underrated because I really hadn't heard many people talk about it. I guess within the fans of Barth, people talk about it. It's definitely one worth talking about, and there's a lot to talk about as you hear me rambling about it for a book that's 200 pages. But yeah, I highly recommend, especially for someone who is into these kinds of books and at that period of their life. All right, number 8. I don't remember if I've got it. Let's see. Number 8 I do not have with me, and that is The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I read this book. I've never read a Ta-Nehisi Coates book prior to this. This just came out this year, which is surprising, actually. I have quite a few 2024 releases or republications this year. It feels very contemporary, which is strange for me because I feel like I don't follow a lot of literary trends. I don't really keep up with books and stuff like that, or book releases, I should say. Last 2 books were from the 50s. So with Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Message. This came out, I want to say October, and it's getting a lot of people talking about it. This is a book that you probably have heard of as well. It's been very amusing to listen to a lot of liberals kind of trip over their words in terms of how to talk about this. Squeaking and squirming about how to discuss Palestine. It's not that hard. So let's get into it because this is not the last book we're talking about on this list. What we got here is a essay collection from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Like I said, I had never read from him before. I thought this was going to be I mainly read this because I wanted to read what's one book I could read, what's a book that people who are not familiar with the subject of Palestine are going to read and discuss, and can I meet them at this point? Can I relate to them on this level? And I thought, when I hear the name Ta-Nehisi Coates and the reputation he has, it's really just like a book that white liberals will read and kind of pat themselves on the back for having read, kind of stuff like that. And there's nothing wrong with that too, but there's more to it. Let's just say that. This book, The Message, though, it's got 3 essays in it. It's kind of like a travel log of sorts of Coates' experiences. I don't know exactly, sometime in the post-COVID period. He's got first one is him going to Senegal. Second one is him going to South Carolina, where his book is being challenged, being taught. And so he's kind of sitting on the PTA meetings and town hall meetings, stuff like that, and kind of getting a view into a small, more conservative town in the United States. And then the third one is him going to occupied Palestine and seeing the apartheid system set in place by the state of Israel. Not that hard to use that terminology. So what is interesting about this? This is a book that, you might know too if you've looked into this book at all. It had a press piece on CBS Morning Show, and it went kind of viral because it has the presenter using I'm going to misquote this. I've kind of quoted it a bit throughout everything. He says, he talks to Coates and he kind of demeans him in a way. It's like, if I didn't know you, if I didn't know who this person was, I think these works that I've read here in this book are the works of a radical. And then, of course, there's been a lot of people who read the book and they're like, well, this is laughable quote. I'm here to make a different statement and say that, yes, these are the thoughts of a radical in an interesting way. Because it is a book of anti-nationalism. You can't just focus solely on the last essay. You have to look at the entirety. Why would he combine all these aside from just being his most recent vacations? There's a point to collecting all these essays together. You think about it. So the first one is him going to Senegal. And he's going there as a black man who's lived in America, who's never visited Africa before. And there is often this very Hotep kind of mythology of Africa, the motherland of Africa, that black African descendants of slaves, if they only went to Africa, they could tie in with you approach your roots. You'd have a deep connection with it. You would immediately be immersed in this culture because you are of Africa. And he kind of speaks on how that is not exactly true. His dad raised him kind of with these kind of Pan-African thoughts. And I'm not here to judge, or I'm not here to speak on this because I'm clearly not the person to be speaking on that. But these are, Coates' words when it comes to this, is him kind of pointing out that there's a bit of a mythological lie to this, that he really when it comes to beauty standards, when it comes to cultures, when it comes to dialects, him and the Senegalese, they don't necessarily see completely eye to eye. They're more like distant cousins, which is totally fair. I don't think he's really trying to fit this, but he's saying that that mythology is a little bit missed. And so I think this is a great introduction to this idea of anti-nationalism, anti-homeland, because that's nationalism, you think about it, homeland concepts. I think the main message of this book is that no one is owed a homeland at the expense of someone else. So if you get into it, really, he's talking about all these different, how him and the Senegalese are not necessarily one-to-one. But nothing hostile, nothing extreme. I think it's a great way to approach it as a black man coming from America and trying to relate to these other subjects that he necessarily isn't a part of, or he's trying to comment on. So the second essay, like I said, is him going to South Carolina, where his book is being challenged, being taught in schools. This is a very trendy topic of banned books in a lot of conservative areas. A lot of it is the critical race theory stuff and whatever they want to claim. Buzzword of the day. The idea of not teaching actual history, if you're not teaching actual things about slavery or the genocide of Native Americans or all this kind of stuff, is that is a false understanding of American history. It is a very specific lens, the white supremacist lens, to ignore those things and to only teach a glossed over history. And it's disingenuous to everyone, really, because you're living a lie. He's not saying any of this, but subtextually he's saying it by the context of this book. Is you talk about the American mythology, you talk about the Great Expansion, Manifest Destiny, all that kind of stuff. All these kind of excuses they have for the enslavement of black people, for the eradication of the natives, all this kind of stuff, for the stealing of land, all that kind of stuff. So it's he's trying to prove the point. You should be reading his book, not necessarily because it's his book, but because it's you should be having these opportunities should be free. They shouldn't be banned. The third essay on his his trip to occupied Palestine and viewing the apartheid system, seeing all the different ways that people are segregated, seeing the ways that certain people, dependent on your ethnic background, religion, if you are ethnically Jewish, if you are a practicing Jew, you are treated at a higher level than anyone else. What he's doing here, he's just observing. He's observing, the surveillance cameras, the soldiers and how they treat him versus how they treat his tour guides, all this kind of stuff, and it shows, and he compares that to the Jim Crow experience that he is quite knowledgeable in his education and what he teaches of the American history, which is a quite apt comparison. So what I'll say when it comes to this, when he's making these comparisons, is this is nothing new. There's always been, for decades now, I should say, not always, but as long as this has been a conflict, there has been a connection between Black Americans and Palestinians. They have always understood this. This is nothing new. Ta-Nehisi Coates is updating this for sure for a 2020 audience. But if you're coming to this book and you're like, wow, this guy's really connecting a lot of dots, this is how it's always been. All you got to do is look back to civil rights movement. You can look back to the auto workers striking in 1973 over how their pensions were being funded and who was funding them. You can look back at all the anti-South African apartheid movements and who was involved in that. There's so much you could look at with this. This is nothing new. What I think is most interesting about this book is, obviously it's a very popular book. It's crazy how popular this is, and that's kind of why I'm so amazed by it. It's so popular that it brings a lot of these very critical and radical thoughts that are usually in a very academic sense, and a very academic writing process, to a more approachable lens. I think this is something that a lot of people can grasp onto. If this is something that you're new to, if this is if you've never read anything on this, you've never looked into this, you can read this book. I would say please do not stop here. But it's a good introduction. And so that's what I'll say on that, because I will keep talking forever. And I don't really want to make a video solely on this subject. But number 7. All right, we got here another book I do not have because I got this as a gift for someone else. This is The Princess of 72nd Street by Elaine Kraf. This is a book that was originally released in 1979 by New Directions, re-released in 2000s by Dalkey Archive, and then this year re-released by Modern Library with a great new edition. The cover on it, it's great. It's very 2020s. It feels very trendy, but I will say that this fits the vibe of the book great. I think this is a book that, even though it's from 1979, it really relates to modern day and will appeal to a lot of modern readers. And I think a lot of people have been finding it pretty connective, pretty impactful. I've seen it on other lists. Elaine Kraf, she wrote this book in 1979, like I said. It's a short novella. This is a story that covers a woman living in New York City in the 70s, and it's kind of talks about her relationships. It talks about her mental illnesses of sorts. I would describe this, and I have been describing this, as if Eve Babitz wrote The Bell Jar. I think that's probably the most apt way I could describe it. When I read Eve Babitz's LA Woman, which is her work of fiction, first and only work of fiction I've read from her, I was a little disappointed. It's not a bad book by any means, but it's just kind of more of the same of her nonfiction, just a little more exaggerated. And I was hoping that I get a little bit more imagination. Here we get the imagination, but we also get kind of the dialogue and the fun little sparkles of personality that we get with an Eve Babitz. Right here, you get a lot of her thoughts. There's a fun little tangent she goes on about people being too tall in society. It talks a lot about all the different men that she sees in her life, and it goes into a bit of the mental illness aspects now, without it being super direct, because this is once again the 1970s where it's a little harder to talk about these things. But it's a woman who she kind of escapes into that, and it becomes a little bit more fantastical, a little more surreal. Like I said, if you're a fan of The Bell Jar, if you're a fan of Eve Babitz, that kind of stuff, great book. I think a lot of people have been finding it really great. I bought this as a gift for my sister, and I read it really fast because I bought it and then I had to give it to her in about a week. And so I wish I could go back to it. I wish I could have read a little bit slower, even though it's not necessarily a book that takes a long time. But some of my thoughts on it are a little escaping at the moment. When it comes to this book, it really is something that I think a lot of more modern readers will be attracted to, and which I think the cover is a great aspect of that. It appeals to a modern sensibility while still being true to the narrative of it. I will also say, too, that Modern Library, I believe, is republishing her other works, Elaine Kraf's other works, in 2025. So I'm looking forward to that, because this has been a new favorite author of mine for sure. All right, next up, we got number 6. This is The Land in Our Bones by Layla Feghali. This is a Lebanese-American woman writing this book. It's a work of nonfiction, just came out this year. I read this back in May, and I got it from the library, and I've only seen it once in stores. I saw it at a store that does a lot of interesting, nice, holistic, BIPOC kind of stuff. And they had one copy left, so I let my friend buy it. Haven't seen it since, and I've been meaning to get it. The author, she's on Instagram. I've messaged her a couple times. She's very nice, very supportive. This is a great book. What it is a coverage of the Levant and a lot of the more traditional customs, the indigenous plants, and their uses, and a lot of speaking on ancestry, speaking on indigenous culture and indigenous ties, stuff like that. And I found this really impactful. I think if you were someone of Arab ancestry and you're into the spiritualism and you're into the traditionalism in terms of traditional practices, or at least knowing, the history of our people, stuff like that, this is highly impactful. Now, I will say that this book can reach audiences far beyond that, but I think that's the direct audience that will get the most out of this. This is a book, like I said, nonfiction. It covers a lot of the indigenous plants of the region and all their uses in cooking and medicine and, in home life, kind of stuff like that, village life stuff, all that kind of stuff. It's really great in that aspect. That's about part one, I would say. The second part is more on the divine feminine. So you get a lot of stuff on matriarchal traditions, a lot of stuff with birthing practices. And the third part, like I said, is discussions on ancestry, stuff on indigenous culture, stuff like that. I've never really looked at Arab culture and Arab history in an indigenous lens, and I think that's really interesting. It really gave me a better outlook on indigenous cultures at large, just kind of how to understand that. I will also say, too, that it gave me a lot of the real value of this book, I should say. If you think of it, she's a Lebanese American woman who her family, she still has ancestral ties to the villages that her families are from. And that is a very rare privilege of Arab people for many reasons. A lot of it is villages have been destroyed, people have been kicked out of their homelands, people have lost ties, people have, the societies there have modernized a lot, especially, you think about Lebanon, a lot of their society has urbanized around Beirut. So most people do not know these things, but she's gone there and she's been able to experience it firsthand for years and practice this stuff. And having a Western lens, being an American, she can kind of translate that to the diaspora. And when it comes to Lebanese people, they're some of the most in diaspora around the world. More Lebanese people outside of Lebanon than ever are in. I think that's how most diasporas are, but I think it's one of the most extreme examples of that when it comes to ethnicities. I think this is relatable, and she talks about everything from the Levant up until, Iran a little bit too. It is an amazing book. It's an amazing resource, and it is something that, like I said, is highly valuable to people looking for that, people of that background looking for that kind of stuff. And so I really recommend it. Like I said, also very great for understanding indigenous ties. I think it's very interesting to look at a culture I'm more familiar with through that lens to help better understand other indigenous cultures. So I'll leave it at that. I guess one last thing I'll say, and maybe I should have started with this, is the fact that this book feels especially timeful in a time where, for over a year, the lands of Lebanon, South Lebanon especially, have been bombarded, have been bombed, have been heavily destroyed by white phosphorus, the illegal use of white phosphorus, I should say. And that stuff is stuff that will impact for generations. Olive trees at a mass level are, destroyed, olive groves. Just destroying this and having such a extreme impact on this land, because it is about the land. And this book really ties into the idea of, the people who really appreciate and value the land are the indigenous people. They're not the ones destroying this land in such haphazard and horrendous ways. We got Journey of an Ordinary Grief by Mahmoud Darwish. Sorry to make this quite a theme. Sorry. I don't know why you clicked on this. I've mentioned this in my books of beauty books. I had just read this in July, so it was a little bit more fresher in my memory. This is the works of Palestinian author Mahmoud Darwish. Back in 1973 he wrote this. It is unfortunately relevant to our current day, which is, that's the real pain. That's the thing I was talking about in the video, the pain, the beauty and pain of books. The pain aspect of Palestinian literature is that it feels timeless because the struggle has not changed; it has only worsened. This is a book, poetry, prose. I feel like it's a little bit more. There's a little bit more to grasp onto. I'm not someone who's really a big poetry guy. I'm getting a little bit more into it. I think that's a big goal for next year, is to go more into poetry, stuff like that. But he writes in such a beautiful way in this, and he really describes a lot of the imbalance of power in society, in the Israeli society that they create. Something that I think is quite interesting and valuable in this book is just how he's able to tell so much with how little he uses in words. I mean, he isn't like fully limited, but it's quite amazing what he does. He is a quite talented author beyond the subject matter that he talks about, and it, like I said in that video, it only proves and points to the fact that, you know, the real, if he was of any other ancestry, of any other nationality, he would be able to use this talent in quite a different way. And unfortunately, he has to use it to plea to the rest of the world the humanity of him and his fellow people. What I think is so interesting about this book, it's I can't believe it took me this long to read it. I kind of mentioned before, when I come to this kind of subject matter, I typically am reading nonfiction, and so I've been only recently getting into the fiction aspect of Palestinian literature. And this is it's a great starting point. He's written many other books. I've got another one here that I need to get to, In the Presence of Absence, which I believe came out in 2006. So a very much different time period in talking about. 1973 is a very integral part of talking about this subject matter, and I really think that it's just a really impactful book. I should also mention, translated here by Ibrahim Muhabi. I think if you're going to read one book by a Palestinian author, this is probably as good as you're going to get in terms of fiction. But that's not to say this is fiction. This is based in reality. It's really it's him creating characters around his experiences and the experiences of people around him and telling their stories. So I'll leave it at that because, boy, it's going on for a while. Number 4 we got here. Boy, we're getting off this subject matter. Right here we got Richard Brautigan's Willard and his bowling trophies. If you'd watched my last video, I talked about this and hinted that this would be on the list. Willard and his bowling trophies is a 1975 novel from Mr. Brautigan, and it's from his genre fiction period. This is it's up there with Trout Fishing in America as my favorite Brautigan. This is my first of his reading from the genre fiction era of the 1970s. I think it's a quite interesting period in his life. If you haven't read any Brautigan, I would not start with this. But if you've only ever read the 60s stuff, the big names, In Watermelon Sugar, if you've read Trout Fishing in America, Confederate General, if you've only read those and have not explored the 1970s of Brautigan, I would highly recommend this one. I'm going to read some more from that period. I've got a bunch of them up there. If you watched the video, you already know. I'm not doing an overview for those who skipped it. What happens here in Willard and his bowling trophies? This is a book that takes place all in one apartment complex. And so it follows all the characters from the top floor to the bottom floor. And it's a perverse mystery, as it's subtitledly called. What happens? Downstairs, there's a paper bird called Willard. This is based off a real bird that Mr. Brautigan had. And all of a sudden he acquires a bunch of bowling trophies. How do you get them? That's the mystery. The perverse aspect is the kinky things that are going on upstairs with the upstairs neighbors, and they're trying to spice up their sex life. And neither of them are into whatever they're trying, but they're too timid and afraid to mention it to the other person. It's quite humorous, as Brautigan is. It's quite playful. What I really love about this is the characterization. I think this guy really, in this book, he really builds out characters in a lot of ways that I had not seen prior in a Brautigan book. The guys who, what are these bowling trophies? The guys who originally got them are the Logan brothers. Logan brothers, these 3 brothers who are star bowlers, stand-up citizens, model citizens, astounding sons, stuff like that. These bowling trophies going missing, and they are irate about it. They transition from this, stand-up citizen, good Samaritan, to these despicable and quite nasty guys. And so to see that played out in a Brautigan is amazing. That might not sound very impressive if you're not someone who's into Brautigan, But if you've read Brautigan, a lot of times he's often considered too childish. His prose is too simplistic. He's never really matured, and I think this is a really great antithesis to that. I think there's some great. It's one of the most '70s books I ever read. I mentioned this in the video, but this is the most '70s book cover I've ever seen. It's just a great if you've been reading too many heady books like I have, it's a great time. So I won't mention too much more because a lot of those thoughts are in the Brautigan video, which you should all check out. Number 3 is Sophia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya. This one is translated by Elaine. And this is a short novella. It is from the Soviet Russia. So, and if you watched my Northwestern University Press video, which came out in the beginning of the year, I mention it there. I talk a lot in detail about it there. So if you want more details, go there, please. And I also, this is like, it's on my list. It's one of my favorites, and so it's become a new favorite. She's become a new favorite, Mrs. Chukovskaya. I'm going to do a video in the next year talking about her exclusively. So I'm going to read this and the other ones I got up here, which I'll mention in a second as we get into it. This is a novella that was written during the Great Purge period of the 1930s, Stalinist period of Russia. If you know the history, you know a little bit more about that. This was written in 1939, 1940, and it's about 1937. And you think about it, soon after that, I believe this is St. Petersburg is where this is written. World War II happens, and so this manuscript survives the bombings and all that kind of stuff, the siege. And from there, it also needs to survive the Stalinist regime, because if this manuscript was found, it would be destroyed. And it's an amazing thing that I'm holding this in my hands. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a book that might be the star stud of the European Classics, Northwestern University European Classics series. But we'll see, as I have not read all of them. The story here goes that Mrs. Sophia Petrovna is the Soviet everywoman. If you read any Soviet realism, you know that it's a very distinct genre of describing the cultural, the every person, the every man, the every woman of Soviet society, and uplifting them through narrative. And it starts that way, but then it takes a turn. What happens is Sophia Petrovna is I believe a secretary at a printing house in St. Petersburg, and she has an ideal life. She's a single mother, sure, but she's working hard. She is making honest money. She is raising a son who is a engineering student, and he's quite a scholarly guy. He's got some scholarships and whatnot, and one day he goes missing. And something that happens around this narrative is slowly other people are starting to go missing. The police take them, and Sophia Petrovna and her co-workers, neighbors, whoever else, they all comment, wow, I never knew this guy was a enemy of the state. He seems so nice, whatever it might be. And so slowly people are disappearing, and what happens is Mrs. Petrovna's son goes missing, and she finds out that he got taken to one of these prisons. But that can't be true. He's a star student. He's a scholarly guy. He's upstanding son of the Soviet Union. Why would that happen? And she does not believe it for a second. She goes, there must be a mistake, and she goes to the government officials, to those who are imprisoning her son, and they're like, no, this is, he's on the list. We got to take him away. He did these crimes. He's plotting against the state. And the whole time she does not believe it. But everyone around her slowly starts to turn, in terms of they're like, wow, she's really out there protecting her despicable son who's the enemy of the state, all that kind of stuff. I'm keeping to myself. I'm not trying to draw attention to me. I'm not trying to stand up against the government. Why would the government lie? All that kind of stuff. All this, what was happening during the Great Purge, which is a real period of Soviet history. And during that period, a lot of people disappeared. I think pretty much every family was affected, is what is said about Soviet society during Stalin in this period. And eventually, you can't lock up everyone forever, and it kind of boiled over into being a big problem. So it's based in this real history, and this book, if it sounds a little familiar, aside from the historical aspect, this is a very Kafkaesque story. This is the most Kafkaesque story I've ever read by anyone not named Franz Kafka. If you are a fan, highly recommend. It's very short. It's a short novella. It's one of my favorite novellas. Like I said, I want to do a full video talking about this. So what happens? It survived the Great Purge. This book. It survived Stalin. It survived the Nazi invasion. And in 1962, it was set. 1963, set to be published in Russia, in the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, the courts last minute decided. They even paid her advance for this book. They decided against it, and so it could not be published. It was, sure that they were opening up more now that Stalin was not in power, but it was still not, available to everyone. Or I should say, not everything goes in the society. And what happens is then this book is taken to France. It's published in French. It's then published in the United States. In 1965, it's published in France. It's published in the United States after that in Russian. The original English translation comes out in the 60s. This is called The Deserted House. This is the original version. This is, and the censored version, I should say. This is the uncensored. If you're able to get this in the United States, in North America, it's pretty easy to get this. In the United Kingdom, there is a new press that's done this. If you look up Sophia Petrovna, you can find it. There's a really beautiful edition that looks a lot nicer than this. I like these. I like the Northwestern University Press. That's why I made the video. But if you're really into beautiful editions, there's a really beautiful UK edition. But The Deserted House, I haven't read this yet. I'm going to read this for the video and compare them, as that's the original. But I don't expect that to be any better. So I can't recommend if that's a worthwhile use of your time. I would just say read this if you can. And the whole afterword really gives you this narrative that I'm telling you right here about the story. So what happens is that gets published, and it isn't until 1988 that this book is published in Russia, at the end of the Soviet Union. And so it's really amazing, because obviously she's long past by now. Is she? I like to say that she was alive. She lived until 1996. I don't know what... I will get this better for the video, and maybe it'll be a little more organized in my thoughts. But this is a great work of Soviet literature. It's one of the most popular Northwestern University presses that you will find, or at least here in the city of Chicago. And I think a lot of that is probably because it's used to teach in various courses. I don't know what courses, but I can only imagine that these are taught at the collegiate level, whether it be history, whether it be literature. I think it's got to be something like that. Because I see them, I can find this in literally every used bookstore in Chicago. And more people should read it. So I will leave it at that for the video. I should also say I have up here, the only other book I believe that's published in English by her is Going Under, which came out in the 70s. This is a UK press that I got from Mr. Barbwire Books out of Toronto, Canada. This is a UK edition. It was £2 back in the day. And I haven't read this yet, but I will read it for that video and say, is that on the par of Sophia Petrovna? Gosh. All right, we are wrapping this up, but far from the end. Number 2 is Rua Benjamin's Race After Technology, which is a book I do not have with me. I got it from the library. I read this back in February. If you are familiar, maybe, there's been some clips that have gone a bit viral, and the quote from her, black faces in high places are not going to save us. Race After Technology is a book published in 2019, but it feels very relevant for being a nonfiction book about technology to read in 2024, or if you're going to read this next year, 2025. Race After Technology, it comes with 2 components. The idea is that technology is either created without black people in mind, or it's created with the idea of categorizing and containing them. Now, these 2 ideas are both 2 extremes that both racialize a technological landscape. I think when people talk about STEM majors needing to explore more humanities, this is the book that really hits that. And I try to read a lot of stuff on technology, especially modern technology in the business world, as someone who's done a lot of product development stuff, and schooling was not taught a lot of this. I think that it's very interesting to look at from this lens, because it is, it's a quite accurate and apt issue with technology. One of the first examples I remember when it comes to technology being created not with black people in mind is the Xbox Kinect, which, if I don't know if I need to explain this, but in 2009, Microsoft for the Xbox 360 created this Xbox Kinect, which was kind of a competitor to the Wii, where it was no controller at all. It's more of a motion sensor that senses your movements, and that's how you play the game. And it quickly was found out that black people were not registered by this camera, by this system, and that became a whole ordeal and fiasco for Microsoft. People joked about it. I remember at the time, mainly because this was 2000s, a very different way of how people viewed things. But also, I think it comes from a level of uncomfortability. It comes from people thinking that we are better as a society, and we are really not. When it comes to not designing technology with black people in mind, it's often because black people are not in the development room, they are not in the testing subjects, and it shows a bias in the developers. This is something that we see a lot in society. But when it comes to surveillance, though, being able to categorize and contain, a lot of these surveillance systems are designed where they see, what is a predator, what is a problem, and often that is racialized. I think that you can draw a lot of ties to other societies where there is an outsider, an out-group to an in-group. As we've mentioned earlier, a lot of these technologies are developed in the state of Israel, for the specific containment and categorization of Palestinians. That is well documented. This is a really apt book. I think it's one that a lot of people should be reading. I think anyone really, but if you were someone in development, if you were some sort of product development kind of person or developer, and you have any sort of say in how technology is developed and made in your company or organization, this is a highly impactful book. And like I said, she has another book that I've been meaning to read, and I will hope to get to in the new year. Finally, what is the last book? And I do have this one. This is another one that I made a video of this year. Maybe you're here for that and you've been waiting this whole time so patiently. It's Red Pyramid by Vladimir Sorin. Vladimir Sorin, I made this video reading Obelisk. People like that. I want to say thank you again to the Untranslated for sharing it. This is a short story collection that came out by NYRB. This year, it covers the years of 1981 to 2017 of Vladimir Sorin's career, and it's a really great overview. I think if you're getting an introduction to Vladimir Sorin, I really highly recommend starting here. I haven't even read it yet, but that's because I feel like it's so daunting. Is Willard. Willard is the big, popular, flashy one. Do not start with that unless you are someone who is well versed in Russian literature and it has a taste for the absurd and the obscene. I think this will be a great... Sorry, I'm just fucking knocking shit over at this point. This has been a long video. I really recommend this as a starting point because it ramps up the absurdity and the obscenities. From the beginning to the end, I mean, you get an early start, but you really get eased into it. Early on, Vladimir Sorin is playing with the socialist realism aspect. A lot of these stories are very mundane, very everyday Soviet experiences. And then they turn into something extreme. They turn into something irreverent. Beyond that, because that's a funny concept. But if he only did that, if he was doing that for 40 years, it would be old, it would be tired, it would be boring. You get to see the process of how he really grows as an author reading this book, which I think is the greatest way that a short story collection can be utilized. I think that reading this, you really get a sense of wow, this is I can't believe this is the same author. He's really talking talking in one way and being able to grow and develop in that so extreme over only a couple of years, and then over a couple of decades, he really expands even more. This is where when I first got into Vladimir Sorin, people talked of him as a Russian Pynchon, and I never saw it up until here because you get into a lot of the postmodernism stuff. Some of the stories here feel like Simpsons episodes, which is kind of fun. I should say, not like The Simpsons, but it feels like if you are, a lot of people love to talk about the early Simpsons, the 90s Simpsons, but if you think about that Y2K era into the 2000s, I remember as a kid watching that and thinking there's quite a formula here where they start with some element, there's some narrative, and then by the end of the episode, it doesn't even matter what that initial element was. Or those characters or whatever is going on. It's just one sequence to the next. And that's how these stories feel. They feel like they are narratively set up. And of course, at the same time, these are stories from the early 2000s too. So it's kind of like in tandem with those episodes. And The Simpsons really is a great child of postmodernism. The Pynchon influence. These stories are all great. I think my favorite's Obelisk, which is the one I read, is a great early one. Nastia, Horse Soup, and Tiny Tim are all great ones too. Horse Soup, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's one that I related to a lot as someone who has Crohn's and has dealt with a lot of digestive health issues where it comes to being disgusted by food. It describes it in such a way. It's a very different being disgusted by food, but in that story, it describes it in a way that I felt was very relatable, which I've not read in many other places. I really like. There's a Dalkey is putting out, I believe it's called White Sugar, is another short story collection of Sorokin next month, and I am highly anticipating that. I cannot wait. That is a book I'm looking forward to reading in 2025. Eventually, I will get to Willard. I'm going to be reading Blizzard soon. I bought that a while ago, and I have put it off for too long, but I think it's a great winter read. As the title suggests, I actually started it a long time ago. And let's see. I mentioned it in my Brautigan video, but if you are someone who wants to get a Vladimir Sorin overview, I am more than happy to do that, as I've read most of those. And I've read everything that's currently out, aside from the Dalkeys. That's all I really want to say today, because this video is too long and it's kind of a mess. I apologize for how extreme in many directions it goes for. That's the only thing I'll apologize for. Not for any thoughts or opinions, because I think they're pretty succinct. I don't know. 2024 has been an interesting reading year. I'm looking forward to 2025. I've got plenty of things I'm reading. I'm currently reading, just making a mess here, Vladimir Nabokov's novels. So I'm just only adding to the obscenities and absurdities. Public Burning, adding to the obscenities and the absurdities. What else we got here that we're reading? I don't know. We'll get to it. Cactus Boots reread. Stuff like that. I don't want to make too many promises, but there are plenty of things I want to talk about. The Chukovskaya video, Sorokin video. We'll see what else comes up. But thank you for joining me. This has been a great year. It's been a year now of me making videos, and anyone who's taken an interest, anyone who has really wanted to connect or discuss, it's always been great. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to other things, or making more in the future. So thank you once again, and let me know if there's any of these books you read. Tell me if you disagreed with any of these books. You think they're all trash. Let me know. Do not let me know any political opinions. This is not the place for that. Let me know what you thought was a good book this year. If there's any books similar to these books that I've mentioned here, as you can tell, that they're very succinct and all connect in quite a very succinct way. And yeah, have a good 2025. See ya.